Thank you for joining us for today's NPP Meet the Author interview. I'm Sophia Hupalo, the NPP editorial intern, and joining me today is Chloe Jordan, NPP Special Projects Manager. So today we're chatting with Drs. Yara Carter and Yara Mekawi about their recent early career commentary that they co-authored with Dr. Nate Arnett. And the early career commentary, for those of you who don't know, is a relatively new manuscript format at NPP and the goal of which is to give early career investigators a platform to share their scientific ideas and perspectives. So Dr. Sierra Carter is an assistant professor at Georgia State University, and there her research program focuses on studying how psychosocial factors and contextual stressors affect mental and physical health outcomes in underrepresented populations. Dr. Yara Mekawi is an assistant professor at the University of Louisville. Her lab investigates how racial discrimination and prejudice lead to negative mental health outcomes in racial marginalized groups toward the goal of identifying effective strategies that can ameliorate the negative impact of racial prejudice on mental health. And so their commentary is titled, "It's About Racism, Not Race, a call to purge oppressive practices from neuropsychiatry and scientific discovery." And the article describes how a lack of understanding of the way that race and racism are conceptualized in science and society harms research practices in neuropsychiatry and public health. So the authors also highlight common errors that researchers make when investigating the neurobiological effects of racism and explain how these erroneous presumptions can reinforce racist thinking and racism. So we want to start by asking you to briefly describe the three errors you talk about in your commentary that perpetuate racism and research in medicine.
Thank you so much for this question, and thank you for having us here to talk through our paper that we collaboratively worked together on. And so when we were thinking about the errors, we really tried to make them kind of digestible errors and kind of a discussion of things that we actually see as researchers and as some of us as clinicians as well, and that can really infiltrate how we think about particularly disenfranchised and minoritized people. So the first error is a belief in race as a biological reality. I think oftentimes as scientists, we think of ourselves as people who are promoting equity and wanting to be equitable citizens, but we often don't think about ourselves as human beings who are not diffused from societal context and historical context of inequity and harm. And so this comes from this concept that we talk a lot about, racial essentialism, that comes from our history here in the US of how we thought about Black and Brown people in the US as something about our biology that is different from other people that is causing us to see differences. And oftentimes, whether intentionally or unintentionally, what that can mean when we engage in those practices that become embedded and socialized in our culture is that we're end up talking about people in these genetic vulnerability patterns that are diffused from environmental considerations for what is going wrong, what is the difficulty, what is the problem. And so we talk a lot about really how important it is to really think about the position of systematic racism in our society, but also in research practice to really offset that particular error. And then error two is the perpetuation of bias within research methods. And so in this one, we quickly kind of run through some things that we have also seen in research, but also thinking about things that we could change and do to offset this error. And so we often see papers that control for race without the consideration for racism. We also see often bias in language use, often when we do see differences between racial groups, and that includes words like deficit or deficiency, and even sometimes words like dysregulated without context, right? So if I'm talking about someone who's experienced tons of marginalization, trauma, poverty, and we're looking at differences, and we say this is all because of some individual behavioral deficit. We can see some problems and concerns about a perpetuation of racism from that type of logic and practice, decontextualized from the potential and the likely primary potential reason for that inequity to exist here in our US society. And so one of the things we say in that one is really how important it is to partner with racism scholars. We use a term that is not ours, but we read a lot about from minoritized scholars, including health equity tourism. So even when you're engaging in this type of research without understanding these biases, because we're all, like I said before, so socialized in different ways around these constructs, if without partnering with racism scholars who have done this work and have really engaged and devoted a significant amount of time to this type of research, you can engage in this error continuously without noticing or thinking that you're doing potentially any harm. And the last error that we point out is kind of a conclusion, but also kind of piggybacking off of the other errors as well, which is a detachment of individual racism-related stress from structural issues. So now that we are seeing that racism is a factor, particularly after the murder of George Floyd, often we are seeing more scholars engaging in this work in different ways and practices and racism scholarship. And one of the harms that can happen is we focus still on individual racism-related stress when we know that racism is a multi-level construct that includes things like structural and systematic racism in its perpetuation. And so often what ends up happening is when we only think about individual racism-related stress, we usually come up with individual solutions to problems instead of thinking about structural and multi-level solutions to those problems. And so we really position ourselves to really thinking about what are structural solutions, as well as studying structural racism as a root cause of a lot of inequities that we see.
Thank you so much. That was a excellent, very rich and very clear and concise explanation of a really, really informative and helpful article. One of the things that you point out in the article, I think in that last section, is you emphasize the importance of educating scientists on these common errors, and partly in order to reduce the harmful effects of racism in our field and to encourage collaborations with racism scholars. What would you say, in your mind, is the best approach toward implementing this type of educational effort, interpret it as broadly as you'd like?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that in addition to education, or at the same time as education, one of the next steps for researchers is really to take a step back and, do some really honest self-reflection. And I think, the nature of that self-reflection really depends on the researcher's background. So I think one misconception is that non-Black people of color are somehow exempt from having to engage in these reflections. And that is, of course, not true. And so non-Black people of color, we vary in our proximity to whiteness and our subsequent access to power. And so this means that, we can also be problematic in our research, especially research that's focused on Black populations. So I think, we're included in the group of people who need to be doing this honest self-reflection. And, some of the questions that I think are important for people to ask themselves, some of the questions that I ask myself is, what is the intention of doing this work? So what is motivating this work? Where is it coming from? Related to what Dr. Carter was saying, if the answer is to get funding, then that's not a great answer. That's not genuine motivation. It's not coming from a desire to be effective, to implement change, and is more kind of rooted in one's own getting ahead and taking resources that maybe were not designed for you. I think another question also related to the point that Dr. Carter was making is, am I collaborating with people from the communities that I'm studying in a meaningful and non-tokenizing way? So, if it's more of like I'm inviting X person because Dr. Carter said I needed to in their commentary, then, that's not the type of collaboration that we're advocating for. And so really being honest with oneself about who is being invited to the table and why, and how are they being treated? How are their ideas being considered? And what is the process? Are they only being included in the end after potentially problematic methods have already happened, like Dr. Carter mentioned in error 2, and making sure that that collaboration is rich and meaningful and non-tokenizing. And I think also related to what Dr. Carter was saying was that, asking oneself, is this research, is there potential for it to be harmful? Are there, based on the way that the research is framed, is it very deficit oriented? Is it divorced from all of, the constructs that we are talking about emphasizing, like systemic racism? And, I think one way to do that is just thinking about the biases and potential stereotypes and assumptions that are embedded in the research questions that you're asking. And then I think, the last, important next step in terms of self-reflection is to also, realize that research is happening within other academic context. And so within your local context, within your department, wherever you are you being intentional about change and ensuring that you are not recreating or reinforcing the systems that led to the errors that we discuss in the commentary? I hope that answers your question.
Yes, certainly. I think one of the kind of distinctions that I'm hearing is that it's one thing to be interested in this type of work and to look at race and racism, but you also have to think about what are the implications of this work? Is it being done in a rigorous way that actually has a positive effect on, the research area, but also on public health or more broadly society? So thank you for that, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Switching gears a little bit, we'd love to learn more about both of you and your career and experiences above and beyond what you've written. So thinking about your career, if you could go back in time, if there's any advice you would give your earlier career self that you think would be helpful for junior scientists who might be listening in on this conversation as well, we'd love to hear that.
I really love that question. It caused a lot of self-reflection for me based on Dr. Mekawi's last comment. I think if I could go back to myself and tell me something, I think I would tell myself that the work that I was doing and the work that I was doing in collaboration with others in the area of racism was valid. And so for junior scholars, particularly scholars of color, Black scholars in particular, the work that you're doing is valid and important. And one of the things that often happened to me was often thinking that being a Black woman, knowing and having lived experience in different ways than other Black and Brown people, but also knowing that provides knowledge as well as context to a lot of the things you're doing. And that is not something that we should be taking away.
Right.
We should be also acknowledging and actually looking for that in our field to promote. And I actually, as I have continued in my career, really think that is such a gift that we can offer the field to include more junior scholars, particularly Black scholars, in this particular area of racism scholarship, because that experience is so important to improving the science and moving the science forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's wonderful advice to give your past self, Sierra. I think kind of in a similar vein, I came from a very big department, and as a first and second year graduate student, I attended a lot of job talks. And I remember thinking, wow, like the research that I'm interested in, the stuff that I, really want to do is not represented here. Like it doesn't, it's not even mentioned, even vaguely at any point. And I remember just feeling like, oh, academia is not the place for me. Like this is not a place where I can do the research that I really care about. And that, that was the case for years. I mean, I think up until I applied for and like got a position in academia, I still, didn't feel sure. And then there were more and more positions that were, actively looking for people who do DEI related work. And so I think for me, the advice is to have hope and know that there are a lot of people out there that are actively working to make more space and make more room for so many people, for especially the group that Sierra is referring to, thinking about young Black scholars. And and to just to hold on to that hope and know that you are welcomed and valued in this field.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, that's truly inspirational. It's so nice to hear reminders of how much value people can add to the table. The last thing we wanted to ask you about was if you're looking to take on new students or hire new staff in your labs, and how can someone reach out to you if they might be interested in working with you in the future?
Yes. So if you are interested in working our lab is pretty packed. We got a strong team. So I'm not this year in particular, but next year possibly. I'm not looking this year for a graduate student, but I am potentially looking to hire someone on our team, particularly in the spring of 2023. So if you are interested in racial health disparities, racism scholarship, racial health equity work, we would love to hear from you in the spring of 2023. So stay tuned, but please reach out at that time if you're interested in potentially a higher position. And you can find me on Twitter, through email. I'm at Georgia State University. So if you just look me up, Dr. Sierra Carter, you can find me.
Yes, and the color lab is growing. It's not quite as packed as Sierra's lab, the heart lab, but I will hopefully be adding another fabulous student to the lab this year. It's never certain until much closer to the date, but I would say, yeah, you can also find me on Twitter, and email is usually the best way to contact me.
Awesome. So for those of you listening, please reach out to Dr. Carter, Dr. Mekawi on Twitter, or find their emails if you look them up on Google. So thank you both so much for taking the time to speak with us today. We really appreciate your time and all of your contributions and sharing your thoughts. So if you haven't already, for those of you listening, please check out the article that they wrote on NPP. It's available and linked to in the notes below. And if anyone listening is interested in authoring an early career commentary, we're always seeking inquiries for new ideas. So please spread the word, read the guidelines that are linked in this post, and you can submit to journal@acmp.org. And thank you so much both again for your time.
Thank you for having us.